Your name tag and your chair and be seated. Kim Stacy is anxiously awaiting his presentation on the truth of the battle for the engagement at Halfway Swamp. Kim?
Good morning. My name is Kim Stacy, and in full disclosure, I am a loyalist. Thank you.
Why?
Well, I'm an ex-Yankee, deconstructed, and but I don't give up my loyalty to the crown.
But you're a former Marine, so you're okay.
Yes, sir, I was.
I'm hearing confessions outside.
Do you have enough time?
As long as they're interesting, which I'm sure they are.
For a number of years coming to this conference, no matter where I was in the States, Carol and George sort of nudged me into taking on the myth of Halfway Swamp. And finally, Charles Baxley ordered me to do it. So I promptly went to my library and spent quite a few weeks comparing and contrasting all of the stories, great propaganda mythology stories. Young nations have to have their mythology. I understand that completely. But I like the truth. So what I did was I skipped everything from after 1902, which was McGrady's book, back to the original source. So the original source is printed by William Dobbin James. I love that name. And what he did was in 1821 is the earliest version I can find. It's usually 1825. And he pretty much writes down the story. And we've discussed it, Charles and I and others, that he may have picked it up from veterans that were there in Williamsburg County. And but I think basically he just winged it. Okay. We have your typical militia rifleman, hook nose, a typical British soldier that would have been in this campaign. Wrong button. There we go. Now, if we're going to discuss this, we have to have some ground rules. Who knows the difference between a fairy tale and where it starts?
In the beginning.
Yes, sir.
Once upon
Once upon a time. Oop, wrong button. Okay, why aren't you? Okay, that's not working. So, how does a war story start? Yes, sir.
There was no king.
Yeah, pretty close.
Yes, I know.
And where does a myth start?
Right now.
Yeah. I remember when. So we get there,
good old days.
sort of like when Hitler was taking sniper fire. Okay, for some reason this isn't working, George.
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 Show him the button.
Yeah. Yes, not working. Maybe because the lights stay out. I wonder why.
You gotta face the machine.
Oh, there we go. Okay, once upon a time. Come on.
I think you did have a computer. Double
That
check.
was when you wanted advance.
Advanced is about 3. So much for fancy graphics. There I was. Next one. Remember when? And next slide, please. Okay, topographically, right here we're meeting. Interesting town. It barely exists. I blinked through it the first time. And consistent. And kind of interesting because you got Nelson's Ferry down here. about here. And
Get
then
the
it works for me.
back to the microphone. Go to the microphone.
Right.
Oh, I'm not used to using a microphone. Okay, order of battle. Now this runs a very interesting series of numbers on different authors, original and renders for today. The Crown Forces under McElrath, he had been commanding soldiers since 1773. He fought around Boston, Bunker's Hill, seriously wounded at Guilford Courthouse. This was a man who knew his business. And they had approximately 300 to 400 men. That's all we can do is approximate this. Because the British numbers are usually pretty damn accurate. The American ones, not so. Now, in the various books, in the handouts, you'll see he was herding motley recruits of the 7th. Yes, the 7th was there. Yes, he was herding them in a way. The 7th was an old regiment, mainly up north, got captured in the Army of Convention, reconstituted, came south, and did pretty good work. We'll get to more of them. Also, left out, 33rd Regiment and the Hessians had about 50 men in this. And again, these guys are all highly trained. Interesting thing here that's left out of the American sources is we know for sure he had 1 3-pound cannon. Probably 2. And a large baggage train. Because he was doing the bi-weekly run from Charleston to Camden. And the 64th, that's almost half of the entire regiment. So this is a big group of crack soldiers. And but mainly it's the baggage train that's important. You've got supplies, ammunition, all those good things you need to fight a war. Now at the skirmish, the British sources say that there were 3 wounded. Captain Kelly dies of wounds a few days later. Marion claims 6. Understandable. Marion commanding between 200 and 700 men, mounted and unmounted. The numbers why? So basically, there was equal numbers according to the British sources, and then later it sort of changes, it sort of gets exaggerated. So we're talking about 400 men to a side, probably less than that. About an equal force. And here's an interesting thing. You talk about over the mountain boys with their rifles. According to William Dobbin James, this duel that they had, and I'll get to more on that. Here we go. Had smoothbores. They captured British muskets. And that's mostly what they would have armed in during the Cherokee Wars. Rifles were incredibly expensive. And I can tell you from experience, a crack rifleman like a sniper, they're few and far between. When you see somebody with a large pig sticker on it coming your way, it takes really steady nerves. Because at that point you're thinking about, gee, the northbound mules, South End, looks very good to me right now. And it's December. His horses are worn out, which we'll get to. Fodder was getting very hard to find. And you'll see where he actually has to make a serious choice about what happens with his mounted men. Casualties, 10 to 12 men, and that's from American sources. Now, Dobbin James, when he writes this, he stated he did not remember, but got the story many years later. In his second book, he spun the yarn and left it out of his book, The Swamp Fox. Not there at all. So this is the original place where all this starts with William Dobbin James in 1825. There we go. Now the recruit myth. That plays on a lot of pages in the modern books that were written. And it goes from just recruits. In the British Army, recruit means you not have reached your regiment yet. So the average recruit go to their depot, in this case Portsmouth, and they're going to train for over a year. So they're going to learn light infantry tactics, they're going to learn musketry, they're going to learn what we call square bashing, all the maneuvers you need to survive in North America, how to pack your backpack. So you had senior NCOs training these guys for over a year before they even got on the boat to come here. So they're not, in the true sense, recruits, because the word is morphed, the definition. The 7th had been in America very early, and mostly up Lake Champlain and St. Lawrence area. And here we go, marksman training. Let's go to the next one. Okay, to understand the battles for each of these, I've done this for Utah Springs for David, because he thought the lights just buggered out. Most historians don't think in terms of the logistics of things. So you look at it, during the hot summer days, they marched at night. In this case, there was a full moon. And it's getting cool out, so you really don't need to march at night. The time it takes for a baggage train to go 1 mile is approximately 3 hours. A regular soldier marches at 4 miles an hour. And then to go from Nelson's Ferry to Halfway Swamp took them 7 to 8 miles, or 7 to 8 hours. After they got through Halfway Swamp, then they bivouacked on Matthew James's plantation. And they would have done that anyway. I mean, they got through the swamp, you got good protection all around, and yeah, you're going to take a nap, get ready for the next day. After they go to Singleton's Mill, it's 13 miles, an easy 4-hour walk, even with the baggage. Roads. This is basically what the road looked like. And so you get an idea. The road, 12 foot wide, Roman standard, and wagons, mostly oxen, some whatever draft animal they could find. Okay, here's one. Nelson's Ferry is down here. And then we get up to Rimini, and this is Halfway Swamp right here. Where the highway cuts through, it's almost exactly the same as it was. I just walked it last week. And then the road continues up, and then it hadn't changed much at all. And it goes up past the Santee. We'll talk hills of Santee. Matthew James Farm is right here, approximately 3/4 of a mile to a mile. And then these are the different locations of what we think were Singleton's property.
Now, what is the line? What is the line that's up through the middle? Is that the railroad track?
No, that's the approved highway. Okay, the earliest map we have is 1775, and apparently the guy has never been there. Nelson's Ferry is right here at the bottom, and this road is the highway between Charlestown and Camden. So in this map, they have the hills on this side, and the next map, they're over here. Who knows what cartographers were thinking and doing, but they weren't actually walking the perimeters. Come on. There we go. Mills, in 1825, and again, I'm not sure he actually knew where he was going, but you see this is Halfway Swamp right here. There was a little mill there, and so it was an easy ford. And then Matthew James's property is where they bivouacked. Now, the legend is that they were ambushed, no, and then they cowardly fell behind the fences. No, they were bivouacked, improved defense for the night, and so that's part of the myth that's gone. And then here's the road that goes up towards Camden. This is Manchester. There's only a sign there where the town used to be. And then this would have been the cutoff along the River Road. and then the hills would have been right up here. So the maps don't really tell us much. It gives us general ideas, some important information like Matthew James. We were just discussing the plats. It was like up here, you had another big chunk of land. Oop, there we go. Now going to Singleton's Mill, this is all background. Some people think it was right up here. Look at all the ravines, the cliffs, the hills. This is some tough terrain to take a baggage train over. Especially if you're being pursued, more like shadowed by Marion's forces. Why would you take that? In my military mind, that makes no sense. We also know over here, right across the road, where the road comes up here, Singleton also had another property, and I think that's the one we're talking about. Okay, here's where it all starts. Sketch of the life of Brigadier General Francis Marion. And this is 1825. And the handouts are, so those in the back who can't read this, the red are my additions, just to clarify things. Underlined are the really questionable passages of this legend, as he wrote it. So we have McElroth, strange spelling, but that's actually Major Robert McElroth. And from Nelson's Ferry, the head of one of these escorts. That's probably not the proper term. And Marion was about equal force, that's according to James, assailed him near halfway swamp. It doesn't say bushwhack or anything else, but in later books it does. So, and what we're talking about in that road is west of the swamp, Matthew's Farm, and the name of this road has many different names. These are a few. The Manchester Road, Old River Road, Camp Boykin Road, it's Highway 51 to 120. It was also the Charleston-Camden Road, so it keeps changing. He first cut off 2 pickets in the rear. That would have been probably back at the swamp where where it's forded. And wheeling his main body. Strangely enough, he was near Nelson's Ferry before this skirmish took place. So he was actually to the rear of this column. And when he says wheeling his main body, he'd have to cross the swamp, get his horsemen out in the open areas that are farmed and developed in order to do that. And then flanking them. They're in a camp. This is like 101. And it's all open terrain. McElroth has no cavalry with him, which wasn't really important because he didn't need it. But he was backed up in reserves, Captain John Coffin, New York Volunteers, and about 140 men. Now, the reason they fell back to Swift's Creek is because Marion was behind them. Or around him, because he could sneak around. He knew every back path and road, and his guys did. And the situation became perilous in the extreme. No. Equal soldiers, you've got basically untrained but some skilled soldiers with Marion, but they're mostly all militia. They come and go, and you've got crack British troops. They're not worried at all. Here we go, paragraph 3. This is where the legend of the duel starts. Okay, McElroth sent him a flag so they could parley. And mainly McElroth, who was a true gentleman, he really was pretty much had the American attitude because he'd been here for a long time. He really wasn't happy with the war at all, but he was a professional. And so he's sympathetic. So his men, under his command, strictly, they didn't raid, burn, they paid for whatever they took. And Marion talks about him in great praise, according to James anyway. In defiance, the British are in desperate circumstances, but if he wished, and this is a quotation, if he wished to witness a combat between 20 picked men on each side. Now this is supposedly Marion talking. It doesn't ring true. Marion was a professional. and he always learned from his mistakes. He was ready to gratify him, and the offer accepted and in place, pitched upon the south an oak tree which still stands in that field. Long gone. Oop. Okay. According to Marion, he appointed Vanderhurst, and I'm having trouble finding his records. There's a lot of things I haven't been able to pin down with any certainty because of the virus. So if you know where some of these documents are as we're going, please let me know offline. Price of All Saints is there. And the funny thing is, they drew a lottery. Why would you draw a lottery if you've got all these pitched militia, and some probably really good? That does not make sense. And no one refused the lottery. So they're going to form an Indian files, which is how everybody moved in the South. If you've ever been to a reenactment and they're shoulder to shoulder, that's bogus. That's just theater. I know because I've done a lot of it. And proceeded to the fence, and Marion met and harangued them to the following effect. Now this is supposedly Marion talking. Everything I've read, short of the new information coming out of Marion, this does not sound like him. My brave soldiers, you are 20 men picked this day out of my whole brigade. 140 men is a brigade. 400 men, and in the name of your country, I call upon you once more to show it. My confidence in you is great, and I'm sure will not be disappointed. Fight like men, for it is you have always done, and you are sure of the victory. Does that sound like Mary to anybody in here? Raise your hand if it does. Okay, so right there. Yeah. And again, this is the beauty of the myth. I love this. I mean, it's a good read. The short speech was received with applause by the combatants. Well, probably just the American combatants. And the British are going, U-20, that's it. U-20, you're going out there. So Vanderhurst, which is nearly blind, asked Witherspoon, at what distance would you choose as the surest to strike with buckshot? You do not shoot buckshot out of a rifle. It's impossible. You can double load it, but that's not buckshot. So it's smooth bore muskets. And that's what the British did. They had bucket ball. 2 buckshot on top of a 75 caliber ball. And at 50 yards for the first fire. That is the outer limit of the combat effectiveness of the smooth bore musket for that time period. When I was in competition, I could hit a man-sized torso, not a group, at 50 yards, shooting offhand, standing up. And but it'd be all over the place. You know, you were shooting for the guy's chest, you're lucky you hit him, you're more likely to hit the guy next to him. So I got within 50 yards, and here's the British standing there bored to death. My boy says, I am not a good judge of distance. Mr. Witherspoon will tap me on the shoulder. Makes sense. I will then give my word, and you will form on my left opposite these fellows, the Brits. As you form, each man will fire at the one directly opposite of him. So they're going to be standing there in open order, about this far apart from each other. And apparently the Americans are supposed to line up and do this. And again, I can tell you the British soldiers are going, do. Let's get on with this. I'm hungry. And this is good. And my word for it, few will be left for a second shot. That's an outrageous optimism. The British had now formed a single file in front of the oak. Vanderhurst advanced boldly within 100 yards. That's out of musket range. You could stand there and, moon them all day long. At this juncture, officers were seen to pass swiftly on towards the oak. And at that point, according to this legend, the enemy shouldered their muskets, the Brits, and retreated at a quick step. Everything they did was at a quick step towards the main body. And again, the main body is probably 50 yards behind these guys. Behind the horses might give 3 huzzas. Maybe. And then a shot was fired. Why waste the ammunition? A British officer, of course, on his own, boasted, growled, and proved recreant, cowardly the next morning. Period. The next morning, Major McElroy abandoned his heavy baggage. I haven't worked out the numbers yet, but I've got the formula to do it. You have, let's call it 2 cannon, a wagon with supplies for the cannon, and ammunition, black powder, shot. And with that many men, you're going to probably have 6 or 8 wagons. 3 of those just for the tentage, the food, for the men in the column, and then supplies going up the logistics chain to Camden. He never burned it because he's in camp. They had breakfast, filled in the latrine, organized themselves, and then leisurely walked away. They never burned their baggage. Then the myth here is at night, he left his fires burning and retired silently towards Camden. Marion would have never fallen for that old trick. I mean, since the time of Alexander, that trick worked once. So this, basically, mid-morning, he's already on the march. Don't know what Marion's guys do, but they're probably out scouting and trying to catch up. And they go to River Road towards Matthew Singleton's mill. Now remember the one map, we think that the mill was in the high hills. But if you look at it from a military point of view, that would be silly to try and take baggage trains up and down those ravines and hillsides. You would just stay on the road because he's not afraid of Marion at all. And the distance was about 10 miles. Marion discovered this movement and dispatched Horry with 100 men to get ahead of him. Makes perfect sense. A lot of open country, back roads, great. That's usually what Marion does. To get ahead of him before he should reach the mill. Well, they didn't have the horse strength to do it. The colonel made all possible speed, but finding he could not overtake him, that means they stole the march on him. And horses, at that point, are not doing well. And then he dispatched Major James at the head of the party, mounted on the swiftest horses. That means out of about 140 horsemen or more, they didn't have enough horses strong enough to make that trot. So the swiftest horses were picked out of all the horses, and then a detachment went out. They crossed the middle pond above. We're not sure which one that is. And took possession of John Singleton's house, which stood on the high hills, commanding a narrow defiling road between the hill and the water. And I want topographical map of State Park. That's what leads a lot of people to believe that's where it was. But that doesn't make sense to my military mind. Major John James reached the house as the British advanced on foot. Maybe, just maybe, but it doesn't sound right. The battle starts at noon or 3, depending on what you read. So it starts in the early afternoon. So you see, they weren't harried, they were just taking their time marching to Singleton's mill. And then Singleton's family is down with smallpox. The British already had smallpox. It's the Americans coming from all the back areas, never exposed to it. It was another lecture for another time. He gave them one fire by which captain was killed. That's wrong. Captain George Kelly of 64th was wounded the previous day, 2 men, and they retired. So they shot once and ran away. Especially if McElroy, if Scott has been deployed at the bottom of the hill, he's going to chase off these guys real fast with bayonets. McElroy is now in a stronghold. Marion pursues him no further. Why the hell not? I mean, if you've got 400 men, but we know that his horses were blown, you couldn't get in front of him, couldn't get around him fast enough. So what do? something else. He goes back out marauding, and according to the sources, that's what he did. So he didn't stick it out and try to ambush them further on, which there were plenty of opportunities to do that. Like, he could have got up to Manchester, which was just a few. And this is why I believe it was on that road where this mill was. But we'll eventually, sooner or later in our lifetime, find out. Okay, paragraph 11 is just, according to Marion, he had very high praise for McElroth. Again, McElroth was a gentleman, he was sympathetic to the cause, combat veteran, and he never burned or pillaged. There's a lot of mythology about burning and pillaging churches and putting people inside, like in the movies. I'm very skeptical of most of that. Okay, what I'm missing, because of the virus, the rebel newspapers. I went through all the loyalist newspapers I could find, nothing. Witherspoon, the two brothers, where are their documents? Williamsburg Museum so far has not returned any of my calls or emails. So any place they're going to be is probably there. McCrotty was in that force. Charles turned me on to an expert on McCrotty. He's on holiday, so eventually I'll see what he has. The raw documents, we've been looking for those for decades. I think Charles has somebody looking into it. Is it Ian? Todd. Oh, okay, Todd Brayson, he's great. Anything you want to know about provincials, he's the man. He really is. McElroth documents. Probably not a chance in hell I'm ever going to find those things, but I'd love to. And other things missing that you may know about, especially your local historians, so I can revise this thing before I put it in actually an academic type paper. And that's it. Any quick questions? Sir?
You said that the source of James spun the yarn. What edition of James did you find that were changed from one volume to another?
When you look at Swamp Fox, which was published after 1825, it's not there.
Swamp Fox.
He wrote a book called The Swamp Fox.
Symp.
Well, Symp writes a little bit later than the Swamp Fox did. I went down and James did. You can find that online. And I'm not sure exactly where I got that quote without looking at my footnotes. Other questions?
If you want to read it again, it's on pages 43 and 44 in this version of William W. James.
Now that's why I passed it up. Basically, it was on the slides, but you can look at it later and get the mindset that the duel and the myth of being bushwhacked and all that were simply a figment of his imagination. Perhaps, there were the local legends, because he was from roughly that area. And, the old guys sitting around the fire smoking their pipes, drinking their moonshine, going, yeah, I remember when. And there I was. And eventually it filtered down into mythology. Oh, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
What was the date of that first map that you showed? I didn't know at that time.
The Muzan, 1775.
The one that where you showed the proximity of Halfway Swamp.
That would have been Mills Atlas of 1825. And if you want, I've got my laptop. I can put it on the disk or email it to you. Other questions?